Welcome to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books, the podcast that features conversations with writers of all types. Today's episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books has been sponsored by The Craft Studio. With locations in New York City, on the Upper East Side, and in Tribeca, The Craft Studio is a perfect place to bring your kids for some crafting fun. craftstudioNYC.com. I'm very excited to be interviewing Glynnis MacNicol today. Glynnis is the author of the memoir No One Tells You This. She is a prolific writer and has contributed to the New York Times, Elle, Town & Country, W, and Forbes, among other publications. She also co-authored a book on puberty called There Will Be Blood, The Hello Flow Guide to Puberty with Nama Bloom. A former internet marketing savant working 18-hour days, Glynnis co-founded and runs The List, a private online community of high-powered women. Glynnis, a Canadian, currently lives in Brooklyn when she's not out exploring the world. So welcome, Glynnis. Thanks for being on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming, especially on this rainy, awful day.
Yeah.
Huge.
Welcome fall in New York.
So first of all, congratulations on your fantastic review in the New York Times Book Review.
Thank you.
That was amazing.
It's intense. I mean, I keep saying this whole thing's been intense. It's strange to be reviewed. It's strange. The whole thing is wonderful and like a little overwhelming. And
so what was that like? You like picked up the book review and opened it up, and I know you saw it online, but what was it like just opening it up?
Well, the thing about the New York Times Book Review is they actually let you know, they let your publisher know weeks in advance that you've been assigned for review.
Okay.
And then they give you a general sense of when it's publishing.
Okay.
And then your publisher sees it a few days before it goes live. So I actually had seen it like 3 or 4 days before. You're just not allowed to. I don't know what, I mean, I guess because no one wants to like get on the wrong side of the Times, it doesn't occur to anyone to broadcast that in advance. But so I knew I had seen the review a few days ahead of time, and so it was really wonderful. But where was I? I had to have somebody, I was out of town, and so I had to have somebody, I wasn't out of town. I was for the East Hamptons Authors Night.
Yeah.
And Caroline Waxler went out that morning in Sag Harbor and bought 2 copies of the Sunday Times, which is not nothing because that is a lot to carry home, and brought it back to the house so we could all read it. And it was really lovely. It was really nice. Piper Weiss actually read it out loud over the breakfast table. So it was a pleasant experience.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love that.
It is still fun to see everything in print. Like, as a newspaper lover and a magazine lover and somebody who has a history of in the media, there is something still thrilling about seeing it in print, even if the readership online is, so much larger.
I just posted on my Instagram the other night after I finished a stack of newspapers that I had saved for 3 days and then finally got to them all. I was like, does anyone else do this? Does anyone else get the newspapers and hoard them? And surprisingly, a bunch of people said yes.
Yes.
So I don't feel so alone, but I agree. I like the print.
I can also tell the difference in I've just come back from being in Paris, and I took all social media off my phone and made a point to read books, not just even on my Kindle. And after about 10 days, you really notice, or I do, there's almost like a chemical shift in your brain that your body calms down and your brain feels better, and you just I really believe there's something to reading books or something to reading print. Not having that light in your face makes a difference in how we just feel.
Totally. I feel like reading is the only thing that can keep my attention these days.
Yeah.
Even if I'm watching TV, I have my laptop on my lap.
It's terrible.
But reading, I'm boom, the world is gone. I'm in it.
Yeah.
So, which is how I was with your book.
Thank you.
No One Tells You This by Glynnis MacNicol. So tell listeners what your memoir is about.
I'm getting better at answering this question. Early on, it's good. I should be able to tell people what my book is about, but early on, I stumbled through it a little. Essentially, it's a memoir of my 40th year. I turned 40. I was single. I didn't have any children. I really felt like I approached my birthday with an enormous amount of dread. And then I turned 40 and swiftly discovered that it was so much better and more exhilarating than I had ever been led to believe, which made me resentful that no one had prepared me to be wow, you could actually enjoy yourself. And then at the same time, it was much more difficult in ways that I was not prepared for. My mother was very ill, and I was a primary caretaker in many ways. And my sister at that time was home alone with 3 small children, and so I was helping out where I could there. And so I felt like, and this applies to all women, but in the particular case of this book, I felt like the narratives we tell around the experiences of single women were just so lacking. And the narratives we tell around the lives of women over a so-called certain age were like essentially non-existent. And so I got to the end of that year, and I am a writer, and I'd spent a lot of the year complaining about the lack of stories and had this, what I joke is my Oprah aha moment, where I was like, you were a writer, perhaps. And like I felt like I had enough material from the year to make a somewhat compelling narrative, and so I turned it into a book, which fortunately got published.
I love how you started it off, or you had the whole scene in the beginning when you took the subway out and you were at that random hotel, looking out on the beach. It was just like, when I think of your book, I just like picture you sitting there. Like,
oh, thank you. Yeah, it was so random and last minute, but in that hotel, that little motel in the Rockaways doesn't exist anymore, and it was just I mean, after your description, I can't say I'm totally surprised by that, but anyway. I always think it's too bad though, because like the Rockaways is both so close, and also to take the train is like an hour and a half. It's nice to go out there for a little staycation. I think lots of people would do it if they could, but it just, it's not available. So
and the fact that you did it to celebrate your birthday when you had like a million people offering to do things with you, and you were like, nope, I'm going to do this by myself. I'm taking the train. I'm going to this crazy hotel. I'm making an adventure.
I know. Was great. I really tried to emphasize.
Says a lot about you,
right? In the book, I was like, I didn't want my friends to feel like I was criticizing them, because there was no question that if I'd wanted to have a big party, I could have. But yes, I didn't.
So the parts of the book when you described dealing with your mother's Parkinson's disease were really, really moving. There was one scene with your mom, who you had said had almost never gotten angry before, and she suddenly turned on you like a stranger. After telling her she couldn't go home because she was home, you wrote, I watched a wave of horrific amazement sweep over her, and for a minute I was reminded of the exaggerated acting in the old Twilight Zone episodes we used to watch on Saturday afternoons when I was a kid. She looked wild. Her eyes darted back and forth. The Parkinson's tremors, normally so subtle as to be invisible, jerked her body this way and that. It was as if my mother had disappeared and been replaced with, I had no idea. And then you later say, it took me an hour to get her to bed that night, and many more to calm her down.
Yeah, I haven't read that actually since I wrote it. There's parts of the book because I was writing it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay.
So sorry.
There's parts, my mother died 20 days after I handed the first draft in, so there's parts of the book that I literally, it was a challenge when I first went on book tour to find passages to read that I could read, because it was still, and still continues to be, like the prologue and particularly the epilogue, I wrote in one sitting, and I have never reread at all. I send it to my agent and said, you have to tell me if there's like spelling mistakes in here or anything, because it was too much. So I think one of the reasons that part of the book, we can talk about this in a second, but one of the reasons that those parts of the book resonate is because I was writing very much in the moment, which is both, has its challenge, good and bad. I think you have writing with no perspective whatsoever, and you're writing from like a really raw place. And I think that it's resonating, but it's interesting to me, readers, what they take. I can tell based on the way people talk about portions of the book, sort of what age or what experience readers have with their parents, because some people only focus on the storyline with my mother. Some people complain that there's too much about my mother. Some people don't mention my mother at all. I thought it was so interesting in the Times review that there was so little mention of my mother in that review. It was very focused on the fact I was single, and the reviewer, later said that she was in a similar position. So I think people see in the book or take from it is based a lot on what their experience, which is probably true. There's just a lot in this book. But I think anybody who's gone through anything with an ill parent, particularly Parkinson's, and my mother suffered from Parkinson's-related dementia, which is very similar to Alzheimer's. And anyone is increasingly, I think, that disease is becoming something we're all, unfortunately, becoming more familiar with. It's so unnerving because this person that you know so well becomes completely different. You just don't, there's no good way to handle it. It's so overwhelming. There's a phrase for it that I can't remember. I was trying to think what it was on the way here. It was essentially like a strange mourning you go through. Like you're mourning the loss of the person you knew, even though that person is still present. And it's it's like twilight grief or something like that, where it's just such a strange place to be in because there's no closure to it.
I interviewed a man named John Hennis who's written a series of essays about his mother's Alzheimer's, and he came on and was talking about the exact same thing.
Yeah,
how,
it's so bizarre.
And then how there are no societal really structures to help you cope with that.
Yeah.
But
I think, unfortunately, that'll change because I think Alzheimer's is increasingly becoming a disease more and more people are forced to contend with. There was an amazing piece in the Times the other day about a woman who's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and says she's not ready to retire
Yes, I saw that. Yeah.
Which is...
That was interesting, too.
Yeah. I mean, it's... As with so many things when we have these platforms to talk about them, but also as the baby... My mother was essentially part of the baby boomer generation, ages into all of these illnesses.
Yep.
Baby boomers are always the generation that forces us to talk about whatever. I mean, and in this case, sadly, we're now, their illnesses and their elder care increasingly become, something we're all have to cope with.
That's
so,
true.
Yeah, it's tough, though. Tough for everyone.
This is my last quote about your mom.
Okay.
We can move on, I promise. It's not the only thing I'm interested in a lot of parts, but you wrote, she'd been slipping away for months now, maybe years, a drop at a time, and with each part of her lost, I'd had to ask myself whether I was imagining it. I could still hold her, after all, and hear her, and yet she was not there, too. Just having to deal with that, how did you cope? Like, what coping mechanisms
I think
you
this
use?
book was partly a coping mechanism.
Okay.
I mean, as I said, this book was really written in the moment, which I had a writing teacher once who said you should always wait 5 years to write about anything.
Oh my gosh, I wouldn't remember a thing.
Yeah, and I think her point was that you don't have perspective and you don't understand what was going on. And she's right, because I had to revise this book heavily or do rewrites more than I normally would because I was rewriting to get perspective on things. Like, you don't want to write in anger and you don't want to write in resentment or any of those things. So there's details in this book that I probably wouldn't remember now had I not written them down as they were happening. I almost think that I'm only just coping with it now because I was writing the book as it was happening. Then I revised the book in the aftermath of her death, and then the book is published. She only died a year and a half ago. So it's only like I'm only coming out of sort of this whole
Denial.
5 years. I don't think it's denial. I think it's just that you channel... And grief is such a weird beast anyway. Like, it takes on so many forms, and it can catch you off guard, and it's such a strange... And I think we're talking about that more and more. Friends of mine run a website called Modern Loss, and they put out the book Modern Loss, which is really, really wonderful. But
I have that.
Yeah, figuring out how to talk about grief and how, like, you can sort of feel like, oh, it's been a year and a half, I should be over this or dealt with this, and that's never the case. Like, it just takes on different sort of forms. So in the moment, like, as those things were happening, I dealt with it by eating a lot of chocolate. Okay. I gained like 25 pounds that year. And then in the aftermath, I dealt with it by writing the book. And so you can ask me in a year how I'm dealing with it now, because now it's all wrapped up in the book too. Like, I'm sort of having to come out of the book writing process and just sort of deal with real life. So
just do another book, and then you never have to deal at all.
I say real life. She says, having just landed from Paris, so I don't know how real it was.
Okay, so I'll get away from these, end of life sadness stuff. You had this text relationship, which you described so well. So you basically had like a relationship. It would have been like a pen pal relationship in the olden days.
Of course,
right?
Which sounds very romantic. I think I put it in the book, but someone said to me like, oh, this is like when people used to send love letters to each other over long distances. And I was like, which is true to some extent. Yeah.
So you have this whole long texting relationship with some sort of celebrity, and I've asked you before, and you still will not admit who it is, right?
It's not admit. I just think that we are I think when it comes to stories about women, I really wanted this to be a story that's centered on... me, but on the character of a woman. And I was really keen to keep all the men in it inside roles. Like, it's the same thing when I wrote that Times article about No One Believes I'm Happy. Like, the opening anecdote about sitting beside a well-known writer, it was kind of like, I don't want the conversation around that article. I don't want the conversation around this book.
Right.
To hook onto a famous male name, because that's not the point of the book, and it would very, very quickly become the hook of the coverage.
Got it.
And and that would never be the case for a man, by the way. He could just name as many famous, like we do not center male stories on women that they've been associated with. They're like, that's a side issue. When we talk about Warren Beatty, it's like a side issue of all of the paramours he's had or relationships. And I just want to keep it was relevant in the sense that, like, fame is its own distorting thing, and like the way we can track people. Every single person by dint of social media has like a little fame imprint now, because we can sort of track people's movements around, but it just made it easier to like track someone's movements. But I just kind of am like, it's not about the men in this book function as the same way women have functioned in most male stories, which is they're like side characters or just like accessories to the narrative that
so my attempt to get the name out has failed me yet again.
It's deeply I'm
glad you have a theory about it.
No, I just don't want to give oxygen to it too.
I'm kidding. I don't really care.
Yeah.
I'm just playing. It's only your insistence on not telling that is sparking my interest. The role of the character does not gain any more attention because of it. But it was a very funny, like, modern day dating
completely
thing where you barely ever see someone, yet you become so dependent over text that, like, when you actually saw him once, you wanted to leave to text him
to tell him
the terrible experience you had in real life, which is so funny.
It's like the figure on your phone. You have the relationship with, like, the person in the text messages, but so much of that is like what you're creating on your own, right? They're not there. There's no smells, there's no sounds, there's no like touch, and there's no way for them to irritate you with those things or satisfy you, you know? Right. Like, it goes both ways. There's not somebody sitting there, you know, like snoring in their sleep that you want to punch in the head. They literally just exist on your phone, which is very convenient and very comforting and very much a creation of your own imagination of what you're hoping that person is. So when they show up in real life and they just are completely disconnected from the character you've created, I remember leaving like a dinner date or a date or a night or something with him and just being like, oh my God, that was awful. And then picking up my phone and wanting to text the like character on my phone I'd created that was such a source of comfort to me to be like, I just had this terrible experience. And I was like, my God, it's the same person. Like, and I think we all do that. It's so screwy. Funny. It's like, we're the online self, we're the real life self. And in our lives that can be difficult and complicated, but in relationships, it's just now I am so averse to texting anybody that I'm dating. I'm like, oh no, call me or see me. I'm like, if I go back and read my text messages or even like I don't really use Tinder anymore, but anytime the texting, I see somebody like trying to push the relationship on text, I'm like, oh no, I'm not dating. I'm not going down this road again. It's all IRL from here on out.
I have a new mom friend, which is like, you know, my equivalent of dating at this point.
Yes.
Anyway,
which is true. You can do a dating book about mom friends.
But I was like, I'm going to call you. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to just keep calling this woman. Yeah. Like, because it's so much faster.
Yeah.
Like, I've kind of gone full circle on the whole thing.
Totally.
Like, I can't figure out these new plans. I don't know her that well. Like, let's just talk. Okay, we figured it out.
Let's just talk. Yeah. I know. It's amazing that that's radical now.
I know. In breaking news.
Yeah, exactly.
Mother decides to make a phone call.
Sounds like a New Yorker cartoon called, like, 2018.
Yeah. So I was laughing out loud in the book when you were describing the time you were helping your sister, who was a single mom at that point, with her newborn and her 2 other kids. So you described the scene with your niece and nephew, Zoe and Quinn, and they bring you this pretend cup of coffee. The fact that they were doing that and that you insisted on it was the funny part, too. Because you wrote, since they'd started walking, I'd been encouraging them both to bring me pretend coffee so that when they were old enough to make actual coffee, they would just bring it to me automatically. Yeah. That is some
Just by planning. The way, that is not panned out yet. All of my efforts on although I think my niece has made me snacks. Like, they're getting to the age now they can make their breakfast, and we've reached the point. Like, when I was a kid, maybe this happened to you, where you were the only one that knew how to work the VCR. Like, your parents were like, I haven't got a clue. We've reached that point where, like, the television's connected to the iPad, which is connected to Netflix. And I'm like, I don't have any idea how to turn the TV on, and I'm handing it to my 3.5-year-old nephew, being like, "Go for it! I don't know what's happening."
We had a TV guy come today. They just sent me an email and said, "We just turned it on and off, and now it's fine."
Yeah, exactly.
I was like, "All right,
Great.
thank you." Okay. Anyway, to keep going on this, so you've trained them to bring you coffee, and then you continue writing. This was the first time it had actually worked. I sipped the pretend coffee theatrically as if it were the most magical thing I'd ever tasted, while Zoe clambered up, staring at me with wide, happy eyes. A second later, Quinn arrived, doing a running leap on the bed and sending my head smacking into the headboard and the coffee cup flying. Maybe it's bad that I found that so funny.
No, it's totally. I think that it's. I have a friend who's a professor in gender studies and so brilliant and smart, Marianne Cooper. And we've had conversations where she says, like, gender is all culture. And whenever I'm with the kids, I'm like, I don't think I believe that gender is all culture. The way they behaved was so, different. And, my nephew is so physical and my niece is so sort of, emotional and intellectual from a very young age that it was just amusing to me to, watch it play out of, my niece would climb into bed and, snuggle and want to talk, and then my nephew would show up and it would be I'm about to be physically assaulted. So it was just fun. I love being with the kids, and I wanted that chapter to be I wanted it to reflect sort of the joy and energy and fun, as well as the difficulties, but I do have so much fun with them, and I do really enjoy the energy around, and the school run is so stressful, and I do get frustrated when we talk to mothers as if they talk about the school run as if it's life and death. I'm like, it's not that it's life and death. It's it's the pinpoint of the day. It's how everyone gets through their day, and it is so important. And I just remember feeling when I got the kids to school on time, I'd be like, somebody should give me an Olympic medal for getting this accomplished. And I feel really, it's unfair the way we patronize the importance of those roles and mock, I think, women who talk about them with levels of seriousness. So, and also I just enjoy it. And I might have more enjoyment because it's not my full-time life. There's always, right. I say this in the book, in the back of my head is the knowledge that I have an apartment in New York that I don't have to share with anybody, and I will eventually go back there. But I do like doing school runs, and I do like being with the kids. They're older now, so it's less, I can literally be get dressed and get in the car, or we babysit, and they're can make dinner, because a dinner for us is a hot dog.
I had dinner. We had dinner with this other couple, and my girlfriend confessed to me in a very ashamed way that she had been late to school with her kids 8 times.
Right.
And I'm 8 times.
Right.
So I helped, and she was near tears about it. And I was okay, here's what we're going to do. So if this particular friend, I won't name your name, is listening, you can now call me and tell me you actually listened to this episode. But she, I was okay, here's what you have to do to not be late. And I made her backtrack through the whole day and set the alarm. And now she's so proud. She's never late. Yeah. And she's so grateful. I'm all I did is tell you to set the alarm. But it is so stressful. It's the one thing you have to do. Anyway.
And it goes off the rails so easily, especially getting girls dressed. Oh my Lord. Getting them to wear something that they want to wear. I slip into all of the language that in theory I hate. I'm oh, you look pretty. Oh, do you want to go to the salon? And I'm oh, this is disgusting. But we have to get to school on time.
And so a big part, I shouldn't say Anzo, a big part of your book also was when you decide you don't want to have your own kids. That instead of sort of waiting and hoping and thinking eventually, you decide, actually, you know what, I don't even really want that.
Yeah.
And if I had wanted it, I would have done it. I've accomplished so many other things in my life. It's not this would have slipped through the cracks.
Right.
I must not really want it, or else I would have done it. And so you have this great scene where you're holding Connor, your sister's newborn, and asking, do I want this? And ultimately you say no. But then you add, of course, I might regret it. I knew that, but it seemed to me that going through life-making decisions on what I might possibly feel in a future that may or may not come was a bad way to live. So tell me more about that. And
I think the question around children for me was, it boiled down to, would I be okay without children? This sense of would I be, if I didn't, I think, turning 40 right then, I knew if I wanted to get pregnant, essentially, I needed to make that decision in that moment, on that spot. And I try and emphasize here too, there's a lot of ways to be a mother, because I think too often we confuse pregnancy with motherhood in ways that are really disrespectful to what being a mother really is. And I wanted to say, like, to really emphasize, like, there were ways down the line that if I decided I wanted to be a mother, I could pursue. But the idea, did I want to get pregnant and have a baby, was something I had to look in the face and really make that decision. Because as we know, there is a clock, whether or not we want to acknowledge it or not at all times. And I really just, because I was in this moment of, like, I was in the literal deep end of children. I was having, I wasn't theorizing. I was sitting there with the kids, and I just thought, like, am I going to be okay if this doesn't happen to me? And it really forced me to consider my life as something I had created on purpose, as opposed to something that had happened to me while I was waiting for my real life to happen to me, which I think is the way we often talk to women. Like, oh, you're just, like, not so much anymore, but I very frequently am confronted with, like, oh, don't worry, there's still time. As if you're waiting for life to come. And I just thought, no, my life is something I've built intentionally, that I want, that I value, that I like, that I'm comfortable with. And I'm going to be okay if I don't have kids. In fact, I don't want kids badly enough to upend my whole life in pursuit of them. I think that's really what it came down to. And I think for some women, I know for some women, it's a question of I don't want children, but for me it was far more a question of, like, do I want them enough? And I didn't want them enough, and I would be okay without them. And then, of course, when you say that, so often the response I've been on the receiving end of is, oh, you're gonna regret it. Don't you worry that you're gonna regret it. Don't you worry that down the line you're gonna wish you'd made a different decision. And I'm like, don't you worry that about everything in your life? Like, that the idea that I'm gonna go against what my instincts are telling me. I'm a grown-up. I have a reasonably successful life. I know myself fairly well. The idea that I would go against that on the off chance that 10 years from now or 20 years from now I might regret that decision, like, that seems like a really a terrible way to live. And just on any level. Just like, am I going to regret I don't take this trip to Paris? That's fine. But, like, am I going to regret not creating a life when everything about me right now is saying that, like, I've really investigated this decision and interrogated myself? Then, like, no. And don't insult me or women in general. Don't believe women when they tell you that they know what they want. Is essentially what
Isn't there a whole thing, like, your best guess at how you feel tomorrow is how you'll feel today?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good line. I've never heard that. But I think
it's a saying, or maybe I know I didn't make it up, but I've heard it somewhere. Because I often am like, what should I do? What should I do? It's like, well, how do I feel about it now?
Yeah.
That's my best guess.
And we don't ever talk to women like they know themselves. It's always everything around women's, magazines, culture, everything is like, how you're not okay the way you are. Let us tell you how to make yourself better. Like, we don't actually believe women very easily when they tell us, like, I'm pretty great with how things are. It's always like, oh, no, well, it could be better. And so I just was like, I'm not saying, like, I have all the answers, but I know myself well. I was 40 at that time. I'm 44 now. Like, I have a fairly solid knowledge of myself. I feel pretty secure with how I've lived my life at this point. Like, if I say this is how I feel...
Yeah, we'll take your word for it.
Yeah, take my word for it. And also, what the fat people always feel obligated to weigh in on that. I'm always like, what skin do you have in this game? Because take all that energy and put it towards changing, healthcare in this country, or, like, the support system around childcare.
I find the more people fight for something that is basically irrelevant, like, the more people insert themselves into something in your life, it's just something they're working out.
Exactly, yes.
And so oftentimes I'm like, I'm just going to let this person work this out, and I'm not going to, like...
You're a little overly invested in a life that you have nothing to do with.
Right. I mean, when I'm not, like, in a hyper-emotional state, I can, like, make that distinction.
It's hard.
Unless it's, like, my mom or something.
Exactly.
So you, speaking of this, successful life that you've built, you started out as a bartender / waitress. Okay, waitress in the East Village. Terrible bartender, so I always waitress. I'm sorry, waitress.
In the village.
Like, an image in my head.
But
it was probably not the right. And then you went from there to building this 18-hour-a-day, like, high-pressure, high-power job, which you said was sort of a quote, no clocking out, no off switch, high intensity job. And then 5 years into that career, you said you didn't so much stop as buckle under my own momentum.
God, that's so interesting. I haven't read the book now in like 9 months. I'm like, wow, I did write that.
You did. Yeah. You wrote it. I have it right here. I quote. So tell me about the burnout, because I was really interested. You described sort of the burnout and the spiral into like where you had to basically just stop and regroup in a really great way. So how did you cope with the burnout, basically?
So I was very early on. I was a media reporter, and I was sort of that first wave of media, internet journalism, where there was and I was lucky because I sort of catapulted my way over to a position that pre the internet would have taken like 15 years to achieve. So the internet both allowed me to fast track to a place in my career, but at the same time there was a price to pay for that. So we didn't have discussions in those days about like, you get off work or you shouldn't be answering emails or let's turn our phone off. I was really working nonstop for years. And so when I burnt out, it was so like a spectacular burnout. Like I like cleared my desk and walked home over the Brooklyn Bridge and just like was like, and then I didn't work for 6 months. Now I'm somewhat responsible financially, so I had some savings, but I did not have the amount of savings to facilitate Glynnis not working for 6 months. But it just kept going. Like I'd watch and I'd been supporting myself since I was a teenager. So to say I was watching my bank account diminish was really like all rational thought had gone out the window. And I remember talking to a therapist about it after, and she just said, like, that is the definition of burnout, where you're just not making rational decisions at all. But now I think we take that word more seriously. When this happened to me, I think it was 2012, and I was so early that people would sort of be like, looking at me like I was a little crazy or I didn't know what I was talking about. I wrote an article about it in 2013 or 14, and I still get emails about it. I get emails from college professors. I got emails from Iraq war veterans saying I describe PTSD perfectly. I get emails from like college kids doing papers. So I just happened to be a little early into what I think we all struggle with now, which is the relentless onness that comes with the phone, with the internet. I think probably the news cycle right now is making a lot of us check out in ways that is healthy, because we don't actually, I always say to people, like in August, I took all social media off my phone just because I thought this is the break that I need, and I think probably most people need it. Someone said, well, aren't you worried? And I said, if the apocalypse happens, someone will come and tell me, or I'll see them running down the street. Like, so there are ways to let people know what's going on in the world that don't exist on your phone. But it was so unnerving because I'd been so ambitious, and it was so debilitating. And I remember there was like a full month where I would just like lie on the bedroom floor and watch Golden Girls reruns, and I know, and I would just like be like, oh, to be a 6-year-old woman in Florida in the 80s before the internet, now that is like heaven. Like I was like, that is where my head was at. It was so desperate for an off switch. And at the time it was scary and irresponsible and all those things. And in hindsight, I'm very grateful because it really made me turn and look and say, like, what is it you really want to do? And make some pretty hard decisions that eventually resulted in this book and me doing writing that I want to do. And, Rachel Sklar and I creating a business out of it that still runs. So, but those things, hindsight is always so much more like the book is hindsight, right? It's like you can talk about it and it sounds great, but in the moment it's so, I lived in Brooklyn Heights at the time, and I would walk around. I couldn't pay my cable bill or my internet bill, so everything got cut off. And I would walk, this is before everyone passcoded their internet signal, I'd walk around the neighborhood with my computer looking for like a random signal to get online. And people would see me that I knew, because I knew so many people in the neighborhood. They'd be like, what are you doing? I go, oh, my internet's just down today and I have to like, and they'd be like, oh, okay. But it would make a great scene in a movie, but at the time it was just so pathetic.
No, it's not pathetic. It's, part of your process.
Yeah.
So I want to know what's next for you, and then if you have any advice to aspiring writers.
What is next is, I think hopefully in a novel. I don't think I'll be writing a memoir again. In the interim, I think I'm going to do a short book for Simon & Schuster, just talking about the profession of midwife. They're doing like a series, and I'm going to write the midwife, which is sort of like a little interim project for me to write, but not have to use my imagination too much.
Even better.
And I think probably the next one is a novel. There's a late 90s New York is an ever fascinating place and time for me, so it's sort of in the back of my head. But this book is still sort of chugging along, so a lot of my energy is still focused on this.
Advice. My advice to aspiring writers is, and I got this advice too, and I understand it's sometimes frustrating, is to think of writing as a craft like anything else. Like it's not the result can be magical, but like the actual doing of it is just a matter of doing it every day. And I did it every day because that was my job, to write 15 posts a day. And as much as that was exhausting, when it came to the writing of this book, on days where I felt terrible or my writing felt terrible or I was so discouraged, I had that muscle memory of knowing like tomorrow will be better, because I put in all those hours doing it, that I didn't panic, that I just sat back down at the desk again and I wrote. And there was no like, oh, I'm waiting for inspiration or the muse or all that other nonsense that gets attached to it. Literally, like if you're training for a marathon, you have to run every day. Like as anything else, you just have to keep doing it. And that doesn't sound very inspirational, but it's true. And you will inevitably get better. And also just read. Like, get off the internet is my number one piece of advice in life. Just try and get off the internet for a portion of every day. Leave your phone away from your bed and read for an hour before you go to sleep. Unless you're listening to this podcast, in which case, keep your phone close.
Well, no, because the podcast is for when you're exercising or when you're on the train or whatever. But I do think really, and as we talked about, like listening still exercises your brain and your imagination. I mean, like...
No, I was...
Yeah, no.
Thank you for distinguishing.
You should always listen to this podcast. But yeah, those are my... I do think as beneficial as the internet has been, making time to get off it as much as possible is really helpful for all of our sanity.
Totally agree. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. This was so fun.
All right, thanks. This episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books has been sponsored by The Craft Studio, craftstudionyc.com. With locations on the Upper East Side and in Tribeca, it's a really fun place to take your kids to do some crafting and painting. Bye.